In Africa, too, we find migrations of peoples. Roughly 3,000 years ago, the Bantu-speaking peoples of West Africa began migrating in a southeasterly direction, going diagonally across the heartland of Africa. Now, the central region of Africa is the region of rainforest, and you really couldn't grow cattle there. So the West Africans, who had a cattle-raising culture, abandoned cattle, came into East Africa just at the same time when the Dutch were settling, encountered cattle all over again, and adopted East African cattle. If other regions of West Africa, they were the gold miners that organized caravans across the Sahara. And some of these were major trading and intellectual centers. Timbuktu had a great university. It probably had a bigger population than Paris and London. It was the focus of the gold and salt trade. You know, during the Middle Ages, Islam was highly cosmopolitan. Somebody from Indonesia might turn up in Spain. Spanish physicians would practice at the court in Cairo. Under the Caliphate, the Islamic world was very much integrated and had a great deal of scholarship, particularly in transmitting scientific scholarship. So Ibn Sina, who wasn't an Arab but a Tajik, was kicked out of his country and moved across North Africa, spreading what he knew of astronomy. Later, Ibn Khaldun was sort of the Aristotle of the Maghreb, who studied geology, animal life, people's cultures. So they were constantly changing ways of life throughout the world. The Australians, the original Australians, crossed over from the New Guinea region into Australia. But whereas in New Guinea, agriculture had been developed about 12,000 years ago, in Australia there weren't the resources for it. And so they developed rather elaborate hunting societies with also elaborate cultures. In each part of the world, people developed their own agriculture. I referred to the grains that were developed in the Middle East. There's also millet and rice developed in Asia. And there are two kinds of rice that appeared in Asia. There's I forgot the first name, but indica in the tropics and japonica in Japan. So these became major grains along with millet and sorghum in East Asia. In Indonesia, you have the development of the banana, the sago palm, and a lot of variety of fruits that are not well known here, like the durian. And people had a horticultural way of life, tending gardens of trees. In Latin America, the most important discovery was corn. In the Amazon, cassava. In North America, sunflowers and blueberries. By studying the related species to a cultivated crop, we can get ideas as to where they arose. The tremendous diversity of crops in the Middle East is related to the diversity of climate. And one of the ecological principles is that the greater the diversity of habitats, the more different things could evolve there. So for instance, we have more species of fish in the Amazon than in the Charles. So you have diverse climates allowing the appearance of diversity in plants and animals. Now, one of the things that's special about the Middle East is the diversity of habitat. In many parts of the world, there are extensive areas of desert. In the Middle East, what's special is that you have interspersed areas that are relatively dry grazing regions and more humid agricultural areas like the Valley of Jezreel, which goes from the Mediterranean coast into the mountains. What this meant was that the same people were able to engage both in agriculture and in livestock herding. This may have played an important role in the development of the Middle Eastern cultures. So you have to think of the kinds of habitats that people lived in, and what would that do to what they're able to do, to the kind of agriculture, to the kind of animals. Now, in the most ancient Middle East, you had herds of wild animals. And in the old campsites, the earliest campsites of Paleolithic people in the Middle East, there's a tremendous abundance of the bones of gazelles. Over the course of centuries, gazelles begin to diminish, and then you start getting mixtures of gazelles and antelope and buffalo, goats and sheep. That gives you some hint of the growth of population along with the using up of resources. As populations grew, they also used more resources, and you find that whereas the most ancient cities would have 2 or 3 houses, later on you get places with a few dozen houses. So studying the number of dwellings is a way of getting hints as to how many people live there and therefore what they made a living from. And that whole field is burgeoning now with the study of Middle Eastern archaeology. In the Americas, we tend to think of Central America with the Aztec and Maya, and South America with the Inca and Aymara. But there are other regions as well. For instance, there are the mound builders. The mound builders built edifices dozens or maybe even a few hundred feet high in northeastern North America. We know very little about them because of the absence of writing, but they built long, straight roads. So they had communications among them. They grew corn, and then they disappeared. We don't know what caused them to abandon their dwellings. In the Southwest, you have similar phenomena. The Anasazi, referred to as the ancient ones, are the people who build these cliff dwellings and then abandon the place rather suddenly. I don't remember the date now. I think it may have been in the 1100s. You have their highways, you have their buildings, they vanish. And it may have been related to drought, and it may have been related to invasion, and it may be they simply became somebody else. So it's considered that the Hopi and the Zuni are descendants of the Anasazi. Navajo came in later, migrating down the edge of the Rockies. And they were hunters. After the conquest of the Southwest by the Europeans, then the Navajo were introduced to sheep herding, and that's their major way of life at the present time. So I would like you to be thinking about, how do things change? What's different about the ways of life of people? And this includes the history of our own way of life, but also the ways of life of others. Are there any questions about that? So this could be included in the topics that you choose to work on. That ecology is a historical science, and the history of human settlement, on the one hand, is long. We've only been around as a modern species for maybe 50,000 years, spreading out from Africa. Perhaps closer to 1 million or so in Africa, and then 50,000 or so, or perhaps 100,000, spreading out to the Middle East and Europe. Some people headed north into Europe, and these are the Neanderthal. Recently they discovered another ancient species which is distinct from the Neanderthal. They discovered teeth, some teeth and bones. And these are different from the modern human species. Whereas the Neanderthal migrated mostly north and east, humans migrated east, through the Middle East, and then into Asia. And from Asia, you have migration southward, through Indonesia, and eventually Australia. More recently, on the island of Flores in Indonesia, they discovered a kind of pygmy species of people who the paleontologists refer to as hobbits, after the Tolkien books. They're about 4 feet high, and they coexisted on Flores Island for a period of perhaps a few tens of thousands years with taller people. So far, we don't know anything about what their way of life was like. But the point is that humans are a relatively young species. We've spread out, come only into the Americas in maybe 20,000 years. And with coming into the Americas, we reached most regions where people have been capable of reaching. There are areas that have only been reached in historical times, such as Greenland, Iceland, Tristan da Cunha, the Azores. So we pretty much completed our migration. In the study of ecology, what's special about people is that we have different ways of life. Whereas you can talk about the alligator way of life, you can't really say that about people. Human societies are divided into classes with different ways of life. They're divided into habitats, and obviously nationalities and language. There are several thousand human languages. Now, because of this, because of the fact that ecology is a science of multiple species coexisting, a core notion in ecology is complexity. And this is a way in which ecology is different from some of the other sciences, which tend to focus in increasingly narrow on objects of study. So complexity then is going to be a major recurrent theme here. It's a core to a philosophy of science. The first thing about complexity is that the truth is the whole. That phrase is taken from Hegel. That he said that a human being is made up of arms, legs, and head only after it passes under the knife of the anatomist. That you can talk about people in terms of structure, physiological function, geographic locations, language, culture, ways of life. So in order to understand the species, the truth is the whole. This means that things which are seemingly unconnected, in fact, have connections between them. And this refers not only to biological connections, like how does organic matter in a river influence the population of beavers, but also more social. You might ask, how does the ability of wheat to absorb nitrogen affect the economic independence of women? And when we raise these questions, some of them seem far-fetched and absurd, and some of them will turn out not to be significant. But the important thing is to recognize that things are connected that don't seem to be. And that therefore, in studying a problem of ecology, one of the first things to do is to ask, what is this phenomenon connected to? What might it be connected to? What do we think it's not connected to? Sometimes the connections are obvious, like the relation of predation, who eats who, or competition, which species eat the same food, mutualism, which species improve the environment for other species. They can do this, for instance, by creating habitats. Like alligators create wallows, sort of shallow discs of mud that are wet, where they go to cool off. But that's also a drinking place for herd animals, and therefore it's a hunting place for the large predators, and so on. So always consider, when an animal does something, it's affecting its surroundings, and therefore it'll affect other species. So the second general principle is that organisms are connected to each other. Once again, I forgot to give a break. Yeah, the intention is to take about a 10-minute break in the middle of the class, sometime around 9:15 or 9:30. However, I forget. Okay, so the second general principle is that things are connected, and we have to look at those connections. The third principle is that things change. So in studying any particular thing, we ask, where did it come from? And where does it seem to be heading toward? The biggest error you can make in science is to treat something as constant, which is really variable. In physiology, we discover that the same molecule does different things, not only in different organisms, but also in different parts of the same organism. So if you want to understand what's going on, you have to go beyond what seems to be the obvious. We use the term neurotransmitter. And the reason we use that term is that these are molecules which were first identified in the central nervous system. But in fact, neurotransmitters are found in the gut. And in fact, they're probably more abundant in the gut than in the brain. And in the gut, obviously, they're doing different sorts of things. Glutamate is a molecule which is important in the central nervous system relating to neurotransmitters. But in the liver, it's one of the major detoxification pathways. There are 6 phase 2 detoxification pathways in the liver that help us get rid of toxins from the outside and also internal. So if you're dealing with glutamate in an organism, you have to consider what else is it up to. In an economy, in a place like the school, it's usually assumed that an economic system is a market economy. That's treated as constant, that things will be bought and sold. There are other kinds of economies. There are pre-capitalist economies. There have been attempts at post-capitalist economies. For instance, not all goods that are exchanged are traded. In non-class societies, there's a great deal of gift giving. Some of it is ritual, where at a particular season people would come and exchange gifts. So trade is one of the ways in which objects are moved, but certainly not the only.